Latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point, today Ambassador Mohan Kumar, India's former envoy to France, and we'll have Dr. Alicia García-Herrero, who's the Chief Economist, Asia-Pacific at Natixis and Senior Fellow, Bruegel. Joining us from the Indian capital is Ambassador Mohan Kumar, India's former envoy to France. Ambassador, good to see you after a while.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Completely our pleasure. And for the first time on StratNews Global, our platform, a pleasure to introduce Dr. Alicia García-Herrero. She's the Chief Economist, Asia-Pacific at Natixis and Senior Fellow Bruegel. She joins us from Taipei. Dr. Herrero, thank you for your time. I know it's an odd hour there.
It's a pleasure to be with you both.
Thank you. Just get straight into the discussion. Lots happening, lots to happen. But before I get both your views, I just want to play out India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who was asked a couple of questions from a couple of EU foreign ministers, Norway and Luxembourg, on India's position and the impact of what's happening in Ukraine. This is Dr. Jaishankar.
I could also, I remember less than a year ago what happened in Afghanistan, where an entire civil society was thrown under the bus by the world. Or we in Asia face our own sets of challenges which often, I would say, impact on the rules-based order. So, I would say, quite honestly, all of us would like to find the right balance of our beliefs, of our interests, of our experience, and that's really what we're all trying to do. And it looks different from different parts of the world. The priorities are different. That's quite natural, because both of you are my European colleagues, and I understand that at this moment this would probably occupy you to the exclusion of almost everything else. But there is also a world out there, and I'm very glad that you're sitting here in India, because it would remind you that there are equally pressing issues in other parts of the world. I mentioned Afghanistan. I mentioned the challenges which we faced in Asia. And if I were to put those very challenges in terms of principles, I mean, when a rules-based order was under challenge in Asia, the advice we got from Europe is do more trade. At least we're not giving you that advice. And in terms of Afghanistan, I mean, please show me which part of the rules-based order justified what the world did there. So let's I think see this in the right context.
Ambassador Kumar, assertive, confident India there, talking about its interests, talking about Asia's interests, Afghanistan, Galwan, Ladakh, when the deadly clashes with China happened and nobody said anything about rules order. Your initial remarks, Ambassador Kumar?
I thought that was vintage Minister Jaishankar as well, since many of us in the diplomatic service had the honor of working with him. This was absolutely vintage Minister Jaishankar, but he has a solid point, I think, because in India, the view, I mean, obviously in international relations, Amitabh, you know that where you stand on an issue depends on where you are sitting. That is essentially what the minister is saying. I mean, you are sitting in Delhi, you are sitting in Asia, you had a problem with China, and you're showing the clips as to what happened in Ladakh, and then what happened in Afghanistan. And then suddenly, of course, you have the war in Ukraine. I think part of the problem is nobody really expected Europe to be drawn into a typical 20th century border conflict, frankly. I mean, everyone thought Europe was past this, that globalization, the European Union, the integration of European Union with others, these had resulted in almost a belief that this could not happen in Europe. This could only happen in the third world. And I think the minister is right to that extent in saying that, listen, you cannot be obsessed about what is happening in one area, although we realize it's a very serious matter, it's happening in Europe, etc. But there are other problems which the world faces. So I rather agree with what the minister said, but it doesn't really mean that India does not think what is happening in Ukraine is serious. Of course, it is serious, and which is why I think we have found the right balance. I'm sure others may disagree with that. I think we found the right balance between principles and realpolitik, which is what every country does when you take a position on foreign policy. We had 20,000 students in Ukraine. We have a relationship with Russia. We have a certain strategic dependence on Russia when it comes to defense and weapons. Everybody knows this. This is no secret, frankly. So I think for a variety of reasons, I believe we found the right balance. And even though we did not condemn Russian invasion, I would point out that our statements in the UN Security Council have evolved from saying first that security interests of all countries should be taken into account. We have started saying now that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries cannot be violated. So I see that as a shift, frankly.
Dr. Herrero, does Europe understand what India is saying and doing?
Sure. I mean, India has every right to express its needs, expectations, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But on the same token, I think India needs to understand Europe's standpoint. And I think arguing that this is how things are seen from Europe is basically, how would I say? It's the very same thing as saying these are the way things are seen from India. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem. I think what I would argue is that India has every right to stay basically neutral in this conflict, in the same way as Europe has every right to push forward. And that has to be accepted. And that has consequences for the world. So the more Europe needs to push forward, the larger the consequences will be. So in a way, I think that's something that needs to be accepted. So in the same way as Europe accepts India's position, India should do the very same thing for Europe.
Absolutely. Master Kumar, earlier also the External Affairs Minister had made it clear when it came to, say, oil and gas, when India was criticized for thinking about or even buying cheaper or subsidized Russian oil. He was extremely sarcastic and illustrative, I would say, when he said that, monthly purchases of India or more than that is much less than what Europe does in an afternoon. So both sides are having their differences, and obviously they're talking to each other so that they understand each other's position. Ambassador Kumar?
Yes, Amitabh. I think one is, of course, the quantity purchased by India versus Europe and the kind of dependency that Europe has on purchases of energy products and gas, particularly from Russia. Secondly, there is also a philosophical point of view when it comes to India and sanctions. Normally, India believes that sanctions must be approved by the UN Security Council on the basis of consensus. And then, of course, every member of the United Nations, General Assembly, etc., are required to follow the UN Security Council if the sanctions are imposed by the Security Council on the basis of consensus. So a UN Security Council imposed sanctions, I don't think India could have questioned, frankly. I think the issue with these sanctions is that you have a coalition of the willing, if you like, a handful of countries which are seeking to impose sanctions. And I think if you look at the Indian foreign policy establishment, the Indian positions over the years, we are nervous about that, because we don't want a handful of countries imposing sanctions on countries without, a thorough discussion and an endorsement by the UN Security Council. Having said that, of course, in this case, it was not possible because Russia was a member of the UN Security Council, and Russia would have vetoed any decision of the Security Council, which brings me to the Indian position that the current membership, the current principle of veto, the current procedures of the UN Security Council have outlived their utility. That is the conclusion I would draw. This is not at all reflective of the 21st century. We are still stuck with 5 members of the Security Council who are victors of the World War II. So I think that is where the Indian argumentation will largely lie.
Dr. Herrero, Russian supply cuts to Poland or Bulgaria, or the threats, many countries in Europe have laid out timelines to reduce dependencies. How realistic are those timelines, Dr. Herrero?
I think they are realistic. Actually, as far as I can tell, it could happen even before those deadlines, because there's a number of things happening that are very important. One is the US. This is an energy agreement, which for many, I've heard, would imply that Europe would be buying energy more expensively. But actually, if you look at the numbers, this is not the case. I think it actually makes a lot of sense for Europe to do this. In addition, you also have gas from Algeria. This basically covers the Iberian Peninsula now, but it's actually quite easy to extend that to France and Italy. So I think the situation is not as dire as it looks. It's just that it can't be immediate. And this is why I fully agree with the statement before that Europe cannot expect India to do what Europe can't do itself. But having said that, I think we need to think about the long term strategically. In the medium run, and this is going to be basically in a year, Russia is going to be extremely dependent on China. And China is going to be basically the main provider of resources, which China will possibly decide to do only in its own currency. And the idea of that strategic relationship between, which are here, from India, for India and Russia, might look different in a year. So what I'm trying to say here is that beyond the immediate, there is a pathway that needs to be built as to where India wants to find itself. And I think that's what I think needs to be discussed further. It's not about the immediate, because everybody understands where India stands. And actually, I fully agree with the fact that no more can be expected, because no more can be expected from us either. But down the road, I think there's a discussion to be made. There is an idea of economic partnership. We've gone all the way to a Trade and Technology Council, as you all know, and I think we could go even further. So these are strategic and long-term relations that, in my opinion, will need to come as a consequence of what will happen to Russia in its relations with China down the road. And I think that's where we stand.
Your points are well taken, Dr. Herrero. Ambassador Kumar, since Dr. Herrero brought up the Trade and Technology Council that India and EU have decided to set up now, EU has it only with the US, I think. How significant is that, Ambassador Kumar?
Thank you very much. But before I address that, I just wanted to agree entirely with Dr. Alicia's remarks earlier about medium and long term. Very frankly, Amitabh, I mean, this may be politically incorrect to say it, but as the head of a think tank, I think I can say this. Frankly, in the medium and long term, I can only see our dependence on Russia reducing. Nobody seriously expects us to increase our dependency on Russia. Frankly, that is neither in our interest nor in anybody else's interest. So let me begin by agreeing completely with Dr. Alicia. Having said that, I think the establishment of the Trade and Technology Council is an extremely important development. For me, the conclusion of a free trade agreement between EU and India and the conclusion of an investment agreement between EU and India is of absolute vital necessity. You know that I have dealt with GATT and WTO for 10 years. I was extremely disappointed when India and EU did not conclude an FTA in 2013. I frankly consider it a great missed opportunity for India. I think we must now spare no effort, leave no stone unturned to try and conclude this agreement, because increasingly the world is moving towards resilient trade, resilient investment, and resilient technology partnerships. So what do I mean by resilience? I mean, resilience is a very complex word for a very simple thing. I will only trade with countries with whom I have trust. Is there confidence and trust? So I'm going to trade and trust with the United States, EU. EU is one of the biggest trading partners we have. We've already got an FTA with UAE. We hopefully will have a FTA with GCC. So I see the world moving away, if you like, from a complete model of globalization that we had so far, which is you take the iPhone, you buy the parts from China, you buy the parts from wherever you can, and then you do just-in-time manufacturing. I think, frankly, Amitabh, this COVID-19 and then the war in Ukraine has disrupted supply chains so badly that nobody will now think of doing this. Semiconductors will be made closer to home. So that is why the US is investing in Arizona. India is trying to see if we can make it. I'm sure Europe will like to do that. Nobody is going to depend for one single item which is strategic thousands of kilometers away. That model, I think, is finished. So in that context, I mean, I thought you might ask me later, but I might as well bring it in now. I see the Prime Minister's visit to Europe as very key. He's going to Germany to get to know the new Chancellor. Macron has just won an important re-election in France. So he will go there. I think I was telling you before the show that the last time I was ambassador, I was packing my bags 2 months before retirement when Prime Minister Modi came and met Macron, just when he got elected in 2017. And he's doing pretty much the same thing now. So I think it's extremely important for us to really discuss these issues. In the images showing von der Leyen coming to Delhi, that's a very, very key visit, because the FTA actually belongs to the competence of Brussels. And similarly, we need good ties with Germany, France. I'm glad he's going to go to the Nordic Summit. On the whole, I would say, and going back to Dr. Alicia's remarks, nobody really is going to bother too much if you're going to buy extra oil from Russia in the next 2 or 3 months. I think you have to be clear about the strategic direction in the medium and long term. That is what is going to be relevant.
Strategic direction, Dr. Herrero, I mean, the momentum, Ambassador Kumar mentioned the CEPA with UAE, the free trade agreement. We have ECTA, which is looked at as an interim agreement with Australia. Is there momentum? I mean, we can't wait another 10 years for whether even if it's an interim deal with EU moving on to a FTA with the European Union.
No, I don't think you'll have to wait for 10 years because Europe has changed for the better. I do agree it's frustrating. You know, Mercosur has waited for 20. So I'm not going to say that this is not the case or it hasn't been the case. But I actually think Europe has been shaken so much by this war, let alone US-China strategic competition, that it has realized the very same things I just heard from Ambassador, that it was a missed opportunity, is what is driving Europe to push further and much faster. And you can sense it. I actually was requested to write a report for European Parliament on India EU relations, together with other colleagues from Bruegel, and just the way that, basically after negotiations started in May, literally like 2 days later, we got this request, and it had to be urgent. I've never seen that in Europe, and this was before Ukraine. Now it is essential. And why is it essential for Europe? For two reasons. The ambassador already mentioned one: the reshuffling of value chains. Companies in Europe now are sitting in Shanghai. They can't load their exports to the rest of the world from Shanghai. I mean, it's very dramatic. Beyond that, put it this way, because I think there's a difference between India and China as regards the position on Ukraine. China's position is ambiguous. It's not neutral. It's ambiguous. It's very different. The idea is all about trust. I think Europe now feels uncertain about what China really is, and I think that's a big difference. So, because of all of those two issues, European companies need to start thinking that, first, reducing dependence on China. There's no other country in the world that can offer that size other than India. That it's as simple as this, and I think Europe knows this in and out. On top of that, India has many things in common, even if sometimes we don't realize, but India has the same diversity we have in Europe. We are a mixture of democracies. It's a single market mix of different countries. In a way, India is a country, but in a way with all of the diversity that Europe has, and a democracy itself. And we are both in the midst of this strategic competition between two hegemons. So, I mean, I can't think of any other better way to show the world that there's actually a way out, meaning other players are there, not only the US and China. In a way, it's our responsibility, if you ask me, as Europeans, as Indians, we need to tell the world there is hope. We don't need to be crushed by the US and China. And I think this is so important, that there's no way we can wait for 10 years to show the world that there is a way out.
That way out, Europe, for many reasons, Ambassador Kumar, is reassessing its various relationships and dependencies with China.
Indeed?
Yes. Amitabh, are you asking me? Do you want Dr. Alicia?
Yeah, Ambassador.
Yes.
And then I'll go to Dr.
So I will take off from where Dr. Alicia left. Both EU and India strongly believe in a multipolar world. We believe in strategic autonomy. If you want a multipolar world, India needs EU to be an independent pole. I'm being absolutely frank. India is not strong enough to be an independent pole all by itself, maybe in 20, 30 years. But now we want Europe to be an independent pole. And when I say independent pole, not at present when the EU is an economic giant and a military pygmy. That cannot happen. It has to change. I hope the Ukraine conflict has demonstrated to the Europeans that they need to be an independent military player. There is talk of strategic compass in European Union, which will lead to some kind. I know progress in Europe takes time, just as progress in India takes time, very different reasons. They have 27 countries, it takes time, Brussels takes time, and so on. But I do believe, Amitabh, that the Ukrainian conflict or the war in Ukraine will expedite EU becoming an independent defense player. The interesting thing is, I don't think the Americans will object. They will be quite happy. If Europe spends more on its defense, Americans will be happy, because the Americans also have been guilty in the past for strategic overextension. Right now, this is a perfect time in which the US and EU can combine its resources and play to their strengths. So I really see what Dr. Alicia is saying, that I think can be built upon by EU. And I do strongly believe the war in Ukraine is a tipping point where, and Macron, for example, imagine if Le Pen had won in France. Let me put a hypothetical question to you. There would have been tension between Paris and Brussels, and the whole thing would have been different vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine, etc., etc. So I think we will have to understand that Europe is back, thanks to Macron, thanks to a new chance. Look at the transformation in the position of Germany. Germany, which was nervous about sending troops and sending weapons, suddenly decides we will spend 2% of our GDP on defense. It's a big change in German position as well. So I think there are things which are changing, and I believe that India, EU have a lot of synergies. Yes, there will be some disagreements from time to time. We are both democratic entities, so it's quite natural to disagree. Maybe when the EU says something on labor standards in India, we will have to talk about it. If the EU says something on human rights in India, India should not be unnecessarily prickly and react negatively, because we have a human rights dialogue with EU for a long time now. We have been talking about human rights. Similarly, if Indians face issues in EU, we should be able to take it up with our EU friends. That's what friends do. So I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. But for me, I go back to my point. I think this time there is no time to lose. We must conclude an FTA and an investment agreement, and the Trade and Technology Council should be used by India to get access to technology like 5G, 6G, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. These are areas in which India should work closely with EU. In fact, I will go one step further. I think India's bill on privacy and digital should closely follow the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of Europe, because to me, that is more a model to be followed than the United States or the Chinese model. The European model is much closer to the Indian thinking in this area.
Dr. Herrero, when you talk about China and EU relationship, now, just going back even, 2.5 years from the beginning of the pandemic, there was hoarding of medical supplies, defective kits. Then the CAI was pushed through, I think, over the new year. That's on hold. Economic coercion of Lithuania, the Ukraine invasion, the so-called no limits Russia-China relationship. So there are many reasons why the EU is reassessing its relationships with China.
Indeed. To be frank, it starts even before all of that.
Sure.
And some people argue that the EU just copycat Trump, basically, in the wordings, whether it was rivalry or competition, of course, beyond engagement, which was the old mantra. But I have to say that I lived through the changes of within the European Union. The Commission changed already in 2016, even before we heard about Trump, its position paper on China, the 10 years after the first. And during 10 years of engagement in 2016 already, the EU started to think that there were things that weren't working. And those were from tech transfer to basically no reciprocity, lack of access to market access. And then in 2018, even before Trump started putting real pressure on China, the EU had already brought China to WTO on anti-dumping duty. So what I'm trying to say here is that when people think that this is all about the US, they should realize that the EU started before, perhaps in a more rule-based approach, as is always the case for Europe, but certainly with this idea that China was not becoming the market economy that the EU, let alone the WTO as such, had thought it would become. And I think that was the EU's stance on China, that had to change. And as you all know, that hasn't changed. If anything, it has basically gotten worse in terms of lack of market economy status. And therefore, I think the EU is rethinking its strategy. So everything you said is right, but I wanted to put that into the context of why it is the case. It is strategic autonomy. If anything, is about strategic autonomy as such, which gave Europe its own opinion about China's market structure, economic structure.
You mentioned earlier, Ambassador Kumar, of course, you were ambassador in Paris, but if you want to expand on what you expect from France as the leading nation in the EU, especially Prime Minister Modi is going to meet Macron, probably the first foreign person, unless he goes to Moscow or Kiev in between. In terms of technology and security and military deals, there's a lot of buzz about, more Rafales, maybe the Safran engines, even it's even within the realm of possibility for nuclear-powered submarines in terms of weaning or moving India away from its dependency on Russia, even if it takes time.
Yes, I'm broadly inclined to agree with that proposition for the simple reason that France is arguably the only strategic partner of India with which we have no major issues. We have very important strategic partnerships with other countries. I'm not saying no, but with France, there are no serious issues, frankly. So it's a problem-free relationship, and the challenge is to take it to the next level. Traditionally, France and India have focused on three areas, and it is called the tripod, which is defense, space, nuclear. These are the three key areas in which France and India have cooperated. But now to these three, you can add climate change, connectivity, you can add cyber security, and most important, Indo-Pacific. France is the only country which has real estate in Indian Ocean, which is Reunion Islands and Mayotte. So there is a certain importance between France and India when it comes to doing things in the Indian Ocean. As far as defense is concerned, we have been making the pitch to France that the relationship has to graduate from buyer-seller to investor-investee. That is, it's good that India is buying Rafale from France, but ultimately, the defense equipment has to be made in India, and made in India for India and for exports. So that is really the challenge. How do you grow? How do you go from a buyer-seller relationship to an investor-investee relationship? Because once you start making these things in India, you have challenges like availability of land, power, etc., then local partners, transfer of technology, license. So those are the issues that France and India will need to discuss. And some beginning has to be made by which the French can participate in the Make in India project of India when it comes to defense. It's already happening, but I think it should happen to a much more substantial extent, so that the central objective is, as you said, we have to reduce the dependence on some of our other partners. So I think that will happen. It will take a bit of time, But I'm extremely optimistic about the Franco-Indian relationship. I hope I'm not accused of localitis because I was ambassador there. I am very fond of France, but I really do believe that in the current environment, the Franco-Indian relationship is really in very fine fettle.
Dr. Herrero, if you want to comment on high-tech cooperation between Europe and India, especially in defense and security, and especially in the light of all major European countries, including Brexit UK, or whether they're in Europe or not, that's a different point, having their own Indo-Pacific strategies.
Well, France was the first to have its own Indo-Pacific strategy. The Netherlands, Germany, the EU as a whole, they're reviewing and actually upgrading now that Indo-Pacific strategy. So it might be hard to believe that Europe is interested or, is pursuing this, but it is absolutely true. And because Europe realizes that the center of the world now is indeed in the Indo-Pacific. And I see no reason why Europe should not pursue that strategy. So I think we need to realize that this is not only about the US, the Europe in its own reality does want to pursue this strategy. And again, I think that brings, given what's happening in the world, renewed forces, because the US has its own issues, domestic issues. So the fact that you can count on, in a way, more alliances within this very important idea of the Indo-Pacific is only good news, in my opinion, for everybody. So, I think that we need to think big, because at the end of the day, the challenges are big, and we all know what I'm referring to. So the only way to go ahead is to really work on like-minded partners, and this is not only geography, it's about ideas, and that's why I think it is a good thing that Europe is thinking in the Pacific.
Dr. Herrero, Ambassador Kumar had earlier brought up Germany and the monumental changes that we are seeing being shaped there because of what's happening in Europe as well. If you want to expand on that, because Germany was seen as a laggard of sort for decades in terms of the relationship with China, business, economics, which were not being broken in any manner. Dr. Herrero?
Well, Germany has been a laggard for two reasons. First, the concept of the Indo-Pacific so far, and this is because the US doesn't seem to be finally pushing the economic concept of the Indo-Pacific. We all wish it did, because that would make things much easier. But as we stand, it's more of a security concept, or at least strategic concept. And I think Germany, in its nature, is hesitant not to look at the economy first, trade first, and then, that's why I think it's been very hesitant on moving ahead. But I think this is changing. And the main reason why this is changing is that Germany is fully aware that the low-hanging fruits in China are over. So Germany, with its manufacturing and industrial capacity, needs to go beyond. So the Indo-Pacific serves a purpose that might not be so clear when seen as a strategic and security concept. But I think Europe realizes that for Europe, it will be more than that. And we hope the US takes the baton and pushes for a more economic concept. But I think that's where Germany is coming on this one.
Ambassador Kumar, if you want to just wrap up your thoughts, looking ahead to the Prime Minister's visit, though you have specifically talked about all three areas that he is going to.
No, I will merely conclude by saying that if you genuinely want a multipolar world, only EU and India can swing it. I'm absolutely convinced that EU and India need to cooperate strongly, intensely, more closely. It is only then that you can have a genuinely multipolar world where countries can practice strategic autonomy.
Ambassador Kumar, absolutely appreciate your experience and expertise. Thank you for your time. And Dr. Herrero from Taipei, really appreciate you coming on our channel and our platform, and we do hope to have you many more times in future.
Thank you. And I'm in such an agreement with Ambassador Kumar that it was hard to disagree on anything. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Perfect.
Bye.
Perfect.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Alicia. Bye. See you.
Bye.
Thank you both, and thank you to all our viewers. I did take some of your comments and questions, and not all of them, but do remember that you can continue to support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you've already done that, do spread the word so that your family, friends, and professional acquaintances also do that. There's a way to financially support us as well. You can directly do that through various means that are available on a link that's in the YouTube descriptor. And just wanted to add that YouTube has started a new I think it's called Super Thanks. Now that's a button that you will see next to the like and dislike, thumbs up and thumbs down buttons soon after this stream ends, and you can choose to support us financially there as well. Thank you all for watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.